name is Professor Sebastian Groes. I work as a professor of English literature at the University of Wolverhampton. I will be your host today at this wonderful sunny day with barbecues and football. We'll talk about that maybe at some point, because one of our guests, Jan Carson, has talked about this in her novel, The Firestarters. So I'm going to introduce you very briefly to our guests. Jan Carson, who's a short story writer and a novelist, has written 2 novels, including the prize-winning The Firestarters. She's just published The Last Resort, and next year there will be a new novel, her 3rd novel, The Raptures. We also have with us Eli Davies, who did a PhD at the University of Ulster on personal and cultural memories of home during the Troubles. So thank you very much for being here, Jan and Eli. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to give a kind of a context about why we're here. We're talking about memory, reading fictions from the past and how we remember them, and maybe our different ways of remembering fictions. So this is something we are discussing today, and we're going to do a small test with you as well in the audience. So let's see if I can share my screen. I can. That's really wonderful. So this session is called Novel Memories, and I will contextualize this just over the next 5 minutes and then do this test with you. The project that I'm kind of promoting here today with the help of Eli and Jan is Novel Perceptions. This is an AHRC-funded project that started about 3 months ago. And what we do in this research is to understand how people think about what is literature, how can you measure literariness, but also thinking about what is a good book. So what we are doing in this project is to kind of do a mapping of the UK and think about reaching out to the public, to readers across the UK, and to really probe them about what they feel is good literature, but also what books they really enjoy. So instead of going to literary critics and academics like me, we want to really connect with the public and understand what makes literature valuable for them. So that's called Novel Perceptions, and I will leave some links later on in the Q&A chat so you can have a look at that. What we're doing today is to talk about novel memories. It's one strand that we are pursuing in Novel Perceptions, because I'm really interested in thinking about this kind of fascinating idea that we read, let's say, Frankenstein when we're 16. How do we remember Frankenstein 30 years later or 20 years later? What do we still remember about plots, about the characters, but also what emotions do we feel? What emotions are triggered by thinking back to Frankenstein? So that's one thing that we're doing. And then the next step is basically to think about what happens when you go back to Frankenstein 30 years later. How does your perception change on the novel itself? Have you got more of a kind of a feminist approach because you yourself changed? Maybe the character that you used to love turns out to be a bit of a bully. So those are some of the things that we're really thinking about. And later on, we're going to connect this with Jan and Eli about thinking about how we remember specific periods from the past in, let's say, Northern Ireland or in the Black Country, where my work is kind of based at the moment. So what I want you to do is to rate 3 novels. And there's a little quiz that we're going to do. And if you have any questions or queries, can you use the Q&A box? And if you've got a query for Jan, please do ask Jan, ask Ali, and ask Baz. So keep them coming, because towards the end we'll be thinking about some of the questions that you have, and we'll be trying to answer them. So we've got 3 novels, and I'm going to ask you some questions. And we've done some preliminary tests already on a different project that we're thinking about. So I hope to give you a bit of a result on on what we think is happening when you think back to fiction that you read in the past. So Alan, can you launch the first quiz, please? So this is the first novel. This is kind of a control group novel because we've got lots of data on this. George Orwell's 1984. We've got 5 questions for you. So the first question is, how many passages can you remember about this novel? Can you remember specific passages, or maybe you can't remember anything at all? Maybe you know 1 or 2 passages. Have a look at those questions and think about that. And you can click on the button and then it will log your entry, and we can sort of tally up the results later on, and I can make some predictions about what will have happened. So if you can do that, please, that'd be fantastic. The second question is about prose, about dialogue. Do you remember any sentences or a conversation from 1984? I'm not going to name any names, etc. I don't want to trigger anything. But again, this is about sort of, can you remember any dialogue, maybe something that the protagonist said? The next one is about the ending. A very simple question. Do you remember how the story ended? What happens towards to the protagonist at the end? You may or may not remember. So those are 3 questions about the plot and about sort of factual memory. And then we've got 2 other questions, question 4 and 5, and they are about emotions. So this one is asking you to rate whether you felt strong emotions when you read this novel. Okay, so you have to go back into your own memory and think about whether the novel triggered strong emotions. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you felt no emotions. That could be possible too. And then the final question is about which emotions you felt. So we've got 5 emotions here on the screen. If you can think back to George Orwell, if you've read 1984, which emotions did it trigger for you? So if you can fill out those questions, that would be fantastic. And Alan, you will need to maybe keep tally and publish the results when most of them are in. I mean, if you haven't read 1984, just don't participate, okay? That's completely fine. So, Alan, can you let me know how far we are and publish the results? Okay, this is very interesting. So I'll breeze through these and I'll make some general remarks later on. Okay, so quite a few people can't remember anything at all, and they can't, or they can remember just 1 or 2 passages. So not a great memories of that. Okay, second one, same kind of result. It's really quite interesting. People can't remember any dialogue between, let's say, Winston and Julia. I can now mention their names. And it is interesting, again, 2/3 of the audience can't remember how the story ended in room 101, etc., etc., right? What happens to Winston in the end? Okay, but what is interesting, if you tally up the first 2 kind of results in the emotion box, there's about 60% that people felt strong emotions or some kind of emotions. And yeah, here we've got, interesting, of course, disgust, fear, anger, sadness. Very interesting. Okay, we need to move on. I'm going to close the poll. We're going to go to a new novel by Bernard McClaverty, Cal. Famous novel about the Troubles. Alan, can you again launch the quiz poll. Thank you very much. So now you know kind of what to do. Maybe you can go back in your memories to this novel and answer the same questions, okay? And if you haven't read the novel, because I know that people are looking in from abroad, just don't answer this because we don't want to mess up the results. But oh no, I remember reading this when I was a Dutch teenager, and yeah, I remember it relatively well. So, Cal, do you remember passages from the novel? 1983 it was published, and I actually invited Bernard McLaverty to a conference in Romania about music and literature. That doesn't matter at all. Not sure what I'm saying. So, do you remember or any kind of dialogue between Crilly and Cal? Do you remember how the story ended? Do you remember how it ended? We never used Jane Austen for this quiz because everyone knows how those stories end. And then the questions about emotions, okay? Did Cal trigger or generate strong emotions or not? I'm just wondering what you feel. And then which emotions? Which emotions? Okay, so we need to move it along because we need to talk to Jan and Ellie in a second as well. Can we publish the poll? So same kind of results. It's quite interesting. People seem to, they can't remember many passages at all. But compared to Orwell, we've got a minority who can clearly and vividly recall passages. So that's really quite interesting, I think. No prose is remembered. Sorry, Bernard. And yeah, similar result for how the story ended, yeah? So the same thing that we had with Orwell. And interestingly, even more people have associated strong emotions to Cal, okay? So it's over 65%. So interesting stuff. And here are some of the emotions that it generated. We've got two pretty sad books with anger, fear, and disgust. Interesting. We'll need to move along. Thank you very much, audience. This is really great. We're going to go to the final novel by Joan Lingard, Across the Barricades, for instance, about a love affair between a young Protestant girl and a Catholic boy from this 1976, I think. Yeah, that's right. You know the drill. Go back to Lingard if you've read one of the novels in the series. Think about your memories. Is this a novel that lives on vividly in your imagination, in your memory? Can you remember lines of prose? And do you remember how the story ended? I know how the story ended. And then, did the novel trigger strong emotions? When you think back to it now, at the time of reading, and which emotions? Okay. So, Alan, when you're ready, then I've got about 3 minutes to round off this section. Thank you very much. Well, okay, we've got a winner about not being able to remember passages. It's about almost 3/4 of people don't remember much about this novel. It was published also, I guess, 10 years before Cal, so that may be something there. No lines of prose again. Minority again remembers some stuff, so that's really quite interesting. And we didn't have that with Orwell, okay? which I find quite interesting. And same thing with how the story ended. Well, they run off to England together, so it's kind of some kind of happy ending, and it triggered moderate emotions compared to, I guess, Orwell, and yeah, sadness about the tragedy of their situation, but some happiness, and this may be part of the end. So, okay, audience, this is really interesting, and I'm just going to make some general observations about what we have found when we do these tests, when we ask people to go back to the memory of their fictions, okay? And what happens really is that people don't have any factual memories of novels. They can't remember the ending. Almost half of people can't remember what's happening. They can't remember specific passages or plot turns and twists, and even 50% can't remember the ending. So we do see that there's lots of emotions that we remember. So this is something that we found quite fascinating. So the conclusion we can draw, preliminary conclusion, is that we don't remember the fiction by the plots, by the characters, but by the feelings that it leaves in us, okay? So it's really quite interesting that we remember novels not at the level of consciousness, because consciousness is biologically quite hard, but we do have more of an instinct for remembering the feeling that we have. The trick here now is also that there is another thing taking place. It's not just the feelings that we share, but it's also the life at the period when we read this novel, how we lived our life in terms of the context that shapes that memory. It shapes the emotion that we associate with it. So if you live through a happy period and you read a book, you're more likely to associate happy memories with that novel. And this is partly to do with the reminiscence bump, the period when we really, I don't know, become mature, when between the ages of 18 and 21, when there's a dense clustering of memories taking place. And there's also a period of transition and quite a happy period. And therefore, there is a kind of an emotional bias taking place, whereby if you are in a happy mood when you read a novel, it's also a happy time with that specific novel. So that's something that I would like to discuss with you, with the audience, but also with Jen and Ali. And I'm just wondering, we need to move to our panel. Jen, I'm going to ask you first. Can you give us some of your observations about how you experience your kind of memories of fiction when maybe not these novels, but can you give an example of how you've remembered novels from the past?
I think it was quite interesting, especially with the Kevin and Sadie's books there. I had such a visceral response when that phrase came up because, like many people of my age in Northern Ireland, they were very much on the curriculum when I was a kid. And so I do remember them quite clearly, and I remember acting out parts of them. And as you said, I have warm, positive memories of those books because I was with my friends in school and we were pretending to be Kevin and Sadie.
Yeah.
So I loved that. And I think there's something, yes, books that you read a long time ago, maybe in school, they tend to fall into two categories. One, that you have no notion at all what they were about and you've completely forgotten. And the others, because back in, I did my GCSEs in 1996, and back then you had to learn things off by rote. So I could quote you half of Wuthering Heights because I memorized it back in 96 and it's never gone away. So I guess I fluctuate between half remembered things and things that are very, very clear in my mind.
Very interesting. And do you remember, I mean, you read those novels when you're in your teens. Do you remember kind of autobiographical memories or locations that you associate with, let's say, the Sadie novels? Like
Uh,
a favorite chair, or you remember the location where you read those novels?
This is awful, but I got into big trouble when reading the Kevin and Sadie novels. They were borrowed from the book box, and I think I read them in second form, and I read too quickly, which is a terrible thing for a person to do, to be too enthusiastic about books. So I was actually punished by my English teacher and made to sit on the corner of her desk reading slowly at a proper pace. So that's what I associate across the barricades with.
No speed reading there. And Ellie, could you give us an example when, not necessarily Cal, for instance, but when you go back into your memory, I mean, which novels come to mind, and which novels maybe, I don't know, that trigger specific kind of emotions for you?
Well, for me, I think because I came from quite a bookish family, and I was the youngest of four children, and so it was kind of, there were certain books that were seen as like a rite of passage that I had to read that my older siblings had read. So, like The Great Gatsby, for example. Everyone in my family loved The Great Gatsby, so I felt like I had to love that, like read that and love it and have a strong emotional response. And I remember actually like feeling pressure, when I read it, and I was just a bit like, oh, I don't know, like I didn't feel any particularly strong emotion. I mean, and it's one of those books that I've gone back to and I reread quite regularly now, and I do see something new, and I really love it now. But it kind of grew on me in a way that I was sort of a bit like, oh no, I've done, have I sort of not read it right, or have I missed something? So for me, I think that was definitely, there was a sense of, there was a kind of expectation, I guess, which is a nice, it's a nice encouraging thing, like culture to be part of, but there was definitely that sense. And I think also, if I think about something like Pride and Prejudice, which I encountered when I was a teen, I read it when I was 14, I think, and it was just before the BBC series, which kind of made it into this completely ubiquitous sort of cultural trope, like Darcy and all that. And so I didn't know the ending when I first read Pride and Prejudice, which to me feels like such a like lucky, fortunate kind of thing to be able to read that book now, which is so well known, that story, and really, just inhaling it and feeling so kind of excited by it, because I also knew like that it was this sort of quite canonical text that was seen as good literature, and it was like, oh yes, I kind of got it, like I enjoyed it. So yeah, like those.
I mean, and you mentioned the word canonical, and this is something that novel perceptions is trying to do, right? We're trying to think about how the canon was formed historically, and how we can maybe change the canon to be more inclusive and diverse. And this is why we're here today in Belfast, to talk about these things, about how what issues of representation are we facing today. We've got lots of emancipatory debates taking place, from Black Lives Matter, but also, and this is something why we're here, that there's maybe a geographical bias. I lived in London for a very long time, and the publishing world and the world of kind of, publishing and media is quite London focused, obviously. And I moved to the Black Country, to the West Midlands, and then, it's a whole different ballgame in terms of, if you want to organize events and you want to get your books out, it's much more difficult. You have to work twice as hard. So I'm just wondering if we can start maybe a discussion of how Northern Ireland fits into that, and maybe connecting that to reading and writing, I guess, Jan. So how do you feel about this geographical maybe prejudice against not from London, or not writing in London, etc.? Could you give us a sense of how that works for you?
Yeah, I guess I need to go right back to school to talk about this. Whenever you invited me onto this panel, I sort of freaked out because I thought we'd have to talk about Northern Irish literature we encountered in school. And I didn't encounter anything. I mean, Joan Lingard is literally the only Northern Irish text, apart from Heaney, that we we were at school. And it was all imported literature from England, from America, not even that much from the rest of Ireland. So I think it begins there. It begins with giving our kids a sense of pride in the literature that comes from here, which is about the world that they know, that they can recognise themselves and aspire to contribute stories to that canon that are about them. I mean, I think that's a very basic principle. And I think as you trace that up through my own writing career, I have actively gone out of my way to seek out Northern Irish writing, and sometimes it's been quite hard to find. Some of our best writers, like Janet McNeill and Brian Moore, have been out of print, and you're really fighting hard to get these fantastic pieces of literature back into schools and back into the hands of readers. And I also think you're right, Bas, there is a bit of a bias. I think it's changing, but when I first began to publish 12 years ago, there was a real sense of nobody's interested in Northern Ireland anymore. That story has already been told, which is so desperately naive in the sense that, we're going to be exploring our story for a long time because our story is still unfolding, and there are voices that haven't been heard yet and perspectives that haven't been encountered yet as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there is a problem maybe with the curriculum and how this is centrally imposed upon secondary schools, etc. But also university curricula. It's really about, decolonizing the canon, which is a big thing at the moment. But like I was saying, there's this kind of opening up towards different geographies is very important. And working at the University of Wolverhampton, we are very keen to also push literature from the Midlands. So we are designing new courses to kind of promote that amongst our own students, and hopefully it will trickle out towards other regions as well. So very interesting. Ellie, do you have anything that you want to say about sort of that kind of area?
Well,
You mentioned the canon as well. So
yeah, I mean, it's sort of observed because I'm from London, so I kind of, I realise now, and I mean, this isn't just about literature and publishing and things like that, but how, what's the word? Kind of how self-involved London is as a place, and how it really doesn't recognise that it is so kind of, it doesn't decenter itself. It sees itself as the sort of centre and the default. And often people will talk about place or culture or whatever, and they won't specify that it's London. But that is actually what they're talking about, and they don't feel the need. It's just like, oh well, it's London. That's the absolute. This book about London is about experience. It's about all experience. So it's something I've really. I don't know, like that's a bit more of a general point than what you're sort of talking about, but like that sense of having lived here for 4 years now, I really recognise that bias and that sense of it's hard to crack. It's a hard world to sort of break into and crack.
Absolutely, no, that's very interesting, and but we must keep plugging away at sort of rethinking the canon, rethinking how we can promote literatures from different constituencies, right? So this is why we're here today. This also is a question of how we think about the past, about the recent past, maybe about traumatic episodes. And of course, we can think about the Troubles and how that has been represented at the time, and often you will see male writers who step into the limelight, I guess, and maybe other writers, women writers, maybe not being picked up because of that, and it was all about maybe violence, the public sphere, and not so much the domestic kind of impact, and that also was very much relevant as well. I was wondering, Jan, could you say something about how at the moment, with the new kind of rise of writers and this vibrant community that you have in Northern Ireland in terms of literary production, how are the memories of the Troubles being, I wouldn't say rewritten, but maybe reconsidered and maybe rethought? Could you say something about that? What are the approaches here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Baz, I'll jump in and say that, you know, there's a perception that there was one approach to writing about the Troubles in the past, and it's a wrong perception. People were writing in different intriguing ways. It just didn't necessarily make it outside of Northern Ireland. So, you know, one of my favourite writers is Jan Carson from Cullybackey, and he's largely out of print now, but he did incredibly interesting things with language and perspective and looking at class issues during that period. So, you know, those writers are there, you just have to actively go out and search for them. In terms of what's happening now, I think everything. I mean, it feels like that this is a very exciting time to be a writer from the north of Ireland. You know, we're having people exploring all sorts of different perspectives in terms of gender and sexuality and women's voices and the environment and all of these different angles on the politics and social issues in this part of the world. For me, I have probably been most excited about the rise of non-realist fiction. I'm a magical realist for my sins. And there has been quite a trend for realist literature in Northern Ireland. So to see speculative fiction, we've got a real healthy science fiction community here now, people writing fantasy, and magical realism appearing in terms of, you know, both the fiction writers, but also our poets. Like, you know, I would argue that Damien Smith and Stephen Saxton are dabbling in magical realism. It's definitely in the theatre. Stacey Gregg is doing amazing stuff with non-realist theatre. So that really excites me.
Well, can I just ask about the magical realist kind of strand? Why are people going for this? And even the sci-fi, what is it about? Because in our BBC surveys for Novelist Out the World, we did find lots of responses from Northern Irish readers about more fantasy and science fiction kind of preferences. What's going on?
Well, they say, I mean, I'm not an academic, but they do say that a culture that begins to have a burgeoning kind of science fiction community is a culture that can imagine its future. So that bodes very well for Northern Ireland if we're beginning to be forward thinking and have so many science fiction writers appearing. I think in terms of magical realism is usually associated with challenging the dominant realist narrative, and the dominant narrative quite often aligns with colonialism and empire. So, you know, as we in Northern Ireland begin to re-examine our identity in terms of the UK and Ireland, it makes sense. And like, these are weird times that we're living in. You know, I don't think realism is big enough sometimes to hold the weirdness of 2021. So it makes sense to me.
Very interesting. So maybe you arrived at a hinge moment and you're looking forward in order to rework the past in new ways. Really, really fascinating. And maybe Eli, could you say something about your work and your research on literature and maybe the gendered aspect of that? Because that sounds really fascinating, because the Troubles and the conflict was not just in the public realm, in a political thing, etc. But of course, it trickled into the home as well. Could you say something about that? And maybe can you connect that to the group of writers that Jan was just mentioning? What new exciting ideas do you see?
Well, so there's kind of a couple of things, I guess, that I'd want to talk about there. But so my research is looking at like literary representations of domestic space, and it was looking at like, and as Jan rightly points out, there was lots of stuff being written during the Troubles, you know, that wasn't getting much attention and is now out of print, or was out of print for a long time. And so there was quite a kind of, I mean, like the female line, the anthology, which, you know, was a collection of Northern Irish women's writing that was published in 1984, and that was a very specific effort to challenge the dominant narrative and tell stories about everyday life and relationships and sex and motherhood and, you know, all sorts of things, as well as more explicitly political, you know, stories. And I think those efforts have always been there. It's just that they weren't really considered politics, and you know, they weren't considered like the big important narratives. And I think one of the things that's changing now, and writers like Jan are a part of this, is that we have a much more like literary culture seems to have a much more complex understanding of what politics is now. And those, you know, these narratives are, you know, we can talk about relationships as political. We can talk about, you know, what was happening, domestic labour and all of those things. That's politics. That was part of the Troubles. And that's, you know, very much part of what my work is about, is looking at the home as not separate, not a backdrop. It was actually part of what was going on. And the literature, a lot of the literature that was produced during the time and is also now being produced was, you know, was identifying it as a political space, but it wasn't doing it in the, you know, like, typical.
No, it's interesting, and yeah, what I can gather is that there's much more of a investigation, exploration of the complexities and subtleties of that kind of dynamic, right? So between public space and the private home. And I think the fire starters, Jan, is really something that I was so impressed by, because it's, on the one hand, all those, the bonfires is kind of like an echo of the past, but it's also a new celebration of something that happened that needs to be reinvented. And what struck me is really how you were approaching masculinity with the two protagonists who are struggling for their identity, with Jonathan and the baby, and he's trying to kind of understand, almost through genetically thinking about where he stands and where this is going. And could you say something? I mean, I wouldn't say I want to say this is a crisis of masculinity, but can you pinpoint what's happening to the gender relations in the kind of post-conflict era that you are trying to pinpoint?
I guess when I wrote the Firestarters, I was really interested in silent men, not silenced men, but silent men, because they're something that is quite prevalent in. I'm a community arts facilitator as well, and I work with quite a lot of groups of usually working class men, and a lot of them have seen really desperately awful things and been through really terrible period of history, and they don't talk about it. Sometimes it's an inability to articulate, and sometimes it's a choice. So it's why I don't say they're silenced men. Quite often they've chosen themselves. And I wanted to look at that because it's had a trickle-down effect on a lot of mental health issues here in the North. When people don't talk about what they've been through and they don't have the language to process that, it's very hard for them to find help, and it's very hard to move forward. So I guess I've always been very interested in language around Northern Ireland and how we talk about the conflict and politics and society now, because language is such a nebulous concept here. You know, the beginning of the Firestarters talks about this idea of, you know, truth is a circle from one side and a square from the other. There's no one fixed narrative here. So how we approach language, it's integral, I think, to understanding what happened and also moving forward in a way. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And yeah, I love the sections in which you describe Belfast and the Troubles, and really pick into the kind of the levels of linguistic ideology that were part of that. And it's really fantastic, the way you're kind of rethinking that. And one of the things because we're talking about memory, is really about the collective memory. And I wouldn't say literature is kind of a therapeutic, or obviously kind of device. But do you see that what's happening now is not just a rewriting or rethinking what happened during the Troubles, but also trying to work through some of the darker memories, and how is the collective memory changing because of that? Just wondering how you sense that the memory, the collective memory of the period of conflict, is now being changed because of reinterpretations. Just wondering, maybe Ellie, do you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question because, and it's really nice to be thinking about literature as something that is changed, that has an impact on collective and cultural memory, because often it's not. So, you know, that was part of what I was trying to kind of do in my PhD project, recent PhD project, was making part of what we talk about when we talk about collective memory, because too often it's like songs or drama, or, you know, it's things that can be seen, and actually like literature has got a really important part to play. And I think, I mean, the most obvious example recently would be Milkman, and I think that's really, really shifted something in our understanding of how to talk about, you know, the conflict, because obviously that made a big splash, like it won the book prize, and it's become a kind of a cultural artifact now. So I think that Milkman has really, it's really good to see something like that being seen, you know, being taken on board as a story of the Troubles, because it is a very domestic, you know, it's very domestic, it's very much about everyday life, it's very about relationships, and also language, like, you know, the stuff that Jan was saying, that language uses language and makes such interesting points about language. So I think, yeah, like, I think things are kind of being kind of troubled a little bit and unpicked and unpacked, and literature is you know, something like that. These narratives are a really useful way of doing it.
Can I say something else about Milkman, which I think is really important? I think it's an important text because it doesn't apologise for itself. It is unapologetically Northern Irish. In the sense that, you know, the humour, the language, the social constructs of the family and how those environments work, it doesn't go out of its way to explain itself for an audience outside of here, and yet it's universally loved. I had this incredible experience of being in Jaipur in India and having all of these people who lived in India come up and go, "We love Milkman, it's brilliant." And that it's one of the first Northern Irish texts where I feel like we didn't have to explain ourselves to other people, because it's so frustrating to try and take your work to other places and have to sit and go, okay, let me begin with this, you know, contextualizing, and this is who we are, because it doesn't happen with writers from other places. Like, a lot of writers that I love are writing from contexts in India or Latin America or Russia, and they don't sit down and go, this is a foodstuff from Wheel saying, this is how we structure the family. They assume that the reader will meet them on their level. So I think we need to stop apologising for ourselves, because the culture here is so rich and vibrant. The reader should just step into it.
No, I totally agree. If you continue to present yourself as other, then that implicitly, unconsciously perpetuates this kind of binary logic, and you internalize the prejudice that comes from the outside, and you continue that dominance that comes from, well, I guess, as an empire, I guess. So absolutely, I think that's a very good point. And well, speaking again about the Black Country, the West Midlands, we've got writers as well who write in Black Country dialect. Again, no apologies. You have to read this, imbibe this, and then you will, I don't know, slowly start to understand how language and culture work in that specific part of the world. So I think, in a way, what's happening to Northern Ireland and the West Midlands is really quite interesting, because we got a very vibrant community as well that's really kind of, punching above its weight in terms of literary production. We've got about 15 minutes left. I've got some questions in the Q&A box, so I'm just going to answer those, and maybe that's another starting point for some other questions. So Carolyn Robb says, if you'd asked us about memories of characters, would we've had different responses? Yes, Carolyn, yeah, absolutely. So characters, we have a better sense of the psychology of characters, maybe not so much the language, but yeah, absolutely. If we ask about characters, we carry them with us, specifically our favorite characters, right? So so we don't ask about characters in this poll. but if you can do the other novel memories survey that I just put in the chat, we're asking about characters. So I'd love it if you could do that. You can answer as many books as you want. So so that's one question. And John Gao says, is there something about being forced to read a book at school that prejudices your view towards it forever? Jan, yeah.
I really think it's very dependent on how the book's presented to you. So, I had a wonderful English teacher and a not so wonderful English teacher, and the wonderful English teacher introduced me to Wuthering Heights, and I swear it's one of the reasons I'm a writer today, because of the way Wuthering Heights was presented to me. It felt like all the lights had gone on at once, and it's a novel that I come back to continuously through my career. There are other books that were presented in slightly less kind of enticing ways. And I've come back to my nephew is 12 and he is encountering Shakespeare for the first time, and he was doing The Tempest, and I said, oh, how did you get on with The Tempest? And he said, oh, I don't like it, it's full of old poemy language. And I just was like, oh no, like some teacher has like made Shakespeare not like enticing to him. So, if you are a teacher, be aware that, there'll be kids in your class and it's just going to go sailing over their heads, and there are other kids that you can make or break them with how you enthuse about something. So it's why I think we should invest so much in our teachers.
Yeah, Ellie, you want to add to them?
What about the school impact?
Yeah, because I've got strong opinions about that, but if you want to add.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the things that because for me, GCSE, like, it was A-level. When I did my A-levels, that was when everything really clicked into place, and I really became a proper, up to then it's all a bit distant. My memories of studying fiction at school aren't particularly, it didn't have a massive impact on me. And then when I chose to, do English at A-level, I encountered James Joyce and Alice Walker and studied Shakespeare in depth. We did The Tempest, and I loved The Tempest. It was just taught brilliant. I had a brilliant English teacher, so it was very magical and exciting. So, yeah, but yes, definitely that sense of I should be doing this, and I have to be doing this. It can really suck the joy out of the whole experience.
I must say, The Tempest is responsible for where I am today, which is in my study, which is boiling hot, talking about literature, whilst I could be having a barbecue. I saw The Tempest. I was a young Dutch boy when I was 14. I saw The Tempest, and I was just completely blown away by it. I bought the collected works of Shakespeare, started reading, did English literature, etc. So, but I guess John's question is really about sort of how things are being taught, and also maybe about just how we teach and how we kind of want how we engage with it. So it's become quite formalistic and structural at the moment in terms of how texts are being kind of assessed, right? So there's no love for language anymore. It's really about sort of what is the moral choice of this character, what does this plot turn, this and this and that, but there's no sense of the form of book, the sense of the language that characters speak. So as Jan was saying, so this is when you lose a sense of why a novel is very important, why literature is important. So the more formal aspects of the novel, theatre, poetry is extremely important, and it's become quite formal. Ellie?
Yeah, and I think the exam culture, the sort of the testing and obsession with examination results and things like that has really, really plays into that, and it instrumentalizes literature. So people be like, oh well, I need my English, GCSE or my English A-level to get to this next point, and then to get this job, and it's not talked about as something that's is part of being alive and part of understanding the world.
Absolutely. For the audience, we've got some time left for some questions for Jan and Ellie. Maybe talk about memories of your own experience of fiction. Well, one thing that I wanted to discuss is really some research that we did for the BBC, Novels That Shaped Our World, whereby we are comparing four nations and how they respond to particular surveys for, novels that shaped our world. It's kind of a big engagement project by the BBC. And we found some quirks in the research when it comes to Northern Ireland, and some Northern Irish respondents, they, for instance, do not choose Jane Eyre in the identity survey, which is quite conspicuous because it's the top choice in the other areas. So I was just wondering, Jan, how do Northern Irish readers read differently? Have you got a sense of that? Because we talked about the curriculum, which is centralized, but maybe there is a sense that they go for different areas, different books, different types of books, as you were saying. What other things do you think make a Northern Irish reader?
I think there's quite a big awareness of Irish literature. So, I know I spend an awful lot of time in bookstores and an awful lot of money in bookstores, and you often find that the big sellers are contemporary Irish writers, and also the Irish writers of the past. And definitely as I moved up through the curriculum, there was a sense of reading the Irish canon. I also think, and I don't know if this was peculiar to me, I went to a Protestant girls' grammar, so that possibly has a bit of a sway on what we read. But we read a lot of books which were about issues around identity and like sectarianism, but possibly from other places. So, we read Toni Morrison, and we read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and we read books about South Africa, and I think there was a sense of trying to learn from other cultures. Now, that would have been the late 80s, early 90s. So a sense that maybe we can see our story. If we can't see it in our own story, we can see a similar story and learn from it. Although we did do Jane Eyre, and people in my girls' school loved Jane Eyre, so I don't know if they buck the trend there.
We'll have to see. We need to get more data on that one. But it's always love. So, Ellie, do you have a sense of what makes a Northern Irish reader, and how do libraries fit into that, for instance?
I would say, like what Jan says about the sort of identification with the Irish, the whole all Ireland kind of idea of literature, that seems to definitely that is definitely a strand in how people relate, how people read. It's interesting because I interviewed in the women that I interviewed for my research. I showed them some excerpts of literature, and there was a sense of being aware of like literature. It wasn't sort of seen as, it was quite present, like novels, fiction. It seemed to be something that was quite a kind of part of everyday life. In terms of the women I interviewed.
Interesting. We've got a question from someone. When you talk about decolonizing the curriculum, how does Ireland and the North fit into this paradigm? Very good question. And we've got another question. So, okay, a recommendation, great. Maybe. Ellie, could you speak to that question? So Ireland and the North, Wales, how do they fit into decolonising the curriculum?
I think it's a crucial part of it, really, and I know it's a tricky thing to talk about. And I was at a discussion recently where a forum, an online event that was discussing the possibility of a Troubles Museum. and someone was raising the point that any museum that we have about the Troubles has to engage with the question of colonialism. And then one participant said, "Oh no, we can't. I wouldn't be.
Yeah.
We can't talk about that." And so there's a lot of tension and disagreement about it, but it does have to be engaged with, and I think it has to be kind of confronted head on, really, and have those discussions, but don't be afraid of them. I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that they,
it's very difficult at the moment because there's lots of different parties who want to claim the debate and want to kind of, I wouldn't say hijack the debate, but there is a lot of anger out there, and rightly so. But we need to make sure that we have an even kind of debate there, I think. And yeah, this is after post-colonialism, we're now decolonializing the curriculum, which is great. But that also, for me, entails lots of different things, and not just former colonies, but we need to really have the ideologies that were part of kind of empire, that type of thinking. We need to unstitch that, and that's not just anything to do with geography, it's also to do with ableism. Yeah, so we need to think about disability, and geography, and a number of different things. So Jan, what do you think about that specific question? Where do Ireland and the North fit into this?
I mean, I think it kind of comes back a little bit to what I talked about earlier, of having unique, complex voices that come from this part of the world as well. Like, to me, decolonizing begins with allowing people to have their own voices and to raise those voices in complicated, different ways. And even before we begin like actively bringing in other voices, we need to make sure that folks from here are being able to speak in their own way. So, I'm from a Protestant background, and there are lots of Protestant texts, but they tend to be quite, they tend to be city-based. They tend to also be dominated by male voices, and they also tend to ignore the evangelical Protestant background that I come from. So part of what I'm trying to do at the minute is make sure that those voices that haven't been heard have been raised. Don't always agree with them, but we need all the voices in the mix. And I genuinely think we are moving towards that in the North, where there is there's more of a multiplicity of voices at work than there ever was before.
Absolutely, no, I totally agree. And well, it's festivals such as the Belfast Literary Festival, but also the Wolverhampton Literary Festival, where it's a growing space, I feel, but it's also about the representation and publishing possibilities. So I think maybe online spaces and different publishing opportunities, and publishers like No Alibis, very important for giving a sense that there is a writing community and there's a platform where writers can get their voices out there. So I think that's really, really important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Can I also say, like, to add in that, as well as that infrastructure around publishing and professional writing, that, the community arts sector has been criminally underfunded here in the North, and I think until you begin to support writers who are coming from working class backgrounds and backgrounds where it's difficult for them to access the arts and be able to raise their voices, we're not going to see all of those different voices being heard. So, to me, proper inclusion begins right at the ground level of making sure every child, every person who wants to have access to arts can access it in a way that's easy for them.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I'm just going to make one final comment. I'm happy to continue talking, actually, but just to plug an event that I'm doing with my team, and I'll put this in the chat. So on Wednesday, do we know what Wednesday is? The 16th? 16th of June? Bloomsday. So we're asking kind of similar questions on Wednesday at the Wolverhampton Literature Festival with my colleague Elizabeth Derndy. She's talking to Lisa Blower, a writer from the West Midlands, and Patrick Vernon, who wrote 100 Great Black Britons. And we're talking about how can we create a much more inclusive form of literary celebration, because it's always Marcel Proust, James Joyce, Shakespeare's Day, etc. We need to have different days also for Angela Carter, etc., for Toni Morrison, maybe for Zadie Smith, or maybe for Jan Carson. So if you're interested in this debate, on Wednesday, 5 o'clock, we're talking to Lisa Blower and Patrick Vernon about this. So it's kind of linked to what we're doing here today. Yeah, it's 6 o'clock. Jan, Ellie, I think we need to slowly round off, but do you have any final comments about what we have been doing, speaking about memories of fiction, reading in the specific Northern Irish kind of context?
Well, I think that project about the Bloomsday, what you're doing with Bloomsday, is really interesting, and like thinking about what, you know, literary narratives we reify and which ones we don't, and which ones become worthy of the big day of celebration. And I think those are really important questions to ask, and it fits in with a lot of the things that we've been talking about like the multiplicity of voices that's needed. There's no one Troubles narrative or one Northern Irish narrative or reader or whatever. It's these are really complex things, and so yeah, like decolonization, as you say, is a broader thing, isn't it? About decentering things, about unpacking like the things that we take for granted now.
Yeah, and again, it's do we need a statue in a digital age? But it must be different forms of.
I don't like statues. I think we should stop building.
Yeah,
that's my.
I don't know. I think about this a lot, and how, you know, our culture really seems to like to pick one person. Like, you know, why does it have to be one person's day? Why does it have to be one statue? Why does it have to be one person wins the enormous big book prize? When actually all of this is so subjective. Like, you know, we could talk about books all day, and Ellie could say, I really love this book, and I could say, I thought it was absolutely rubbish, Ellie. And that's what literature is. It's about having different opinions and reactions to it, and yet we seem to just love to condense it down to, we're all going to worship James Joyce now, or, you know, we're all going to worship Beckett for a while. Yeah, there's probably more to unpick there.
Anyway, thank you so much, Jan and Ellie, for your contribution. Really wonderful conversation. This is really the start for my team, because we want to go out to Belfast in October to do two literary events with the Belfast Literature Festival. So thank you very much for this conversation. I need to thank the AHRC for funding this particular event. I want to thank Sophie and Gareth and Alan at the Belfast Literature Festival for hosting and accommodating this event. And that's it, really. Thank you very much for listening to us on such a great sunny day, whether you've barbecues and football, but literature is here. So thank you very much, Jan, Ali. I hope to see you physically very soon, hopefully in October. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, Bess. Thanks.